They were Ohio's golden couple, respected, admired, and envied by many. Janiyah Whitaker, the poised and elegant wife of Judge Rashawn Whitaker, embodied the perfect image of success, grace, and unwavering devotion. In the world of power and prestige, their marriage was seen as untouchable, an unshakable force built on ambition and tradition. But behind the polished smiles and grand appearances lurked a secret that would unravel their perfect world, exposing the dark, twisted lengths one woman would go to in order to protect her legacy. It started with whispers, a name spoken in hushed conversations, a scandal creeping through the cracks of their flawless facade. At first, Janiyah brushed it off. After all, she had heard rumors before. But this time, the whispers carried something far more dangerous than idle gossip. A young woman. A secret affair. And the ultimate betrayal. The revelation wasn't just an insult to her marriage, it was a threat to everything she had built. It was a stain she refused to allow. And in the end, that refusal would lead to an act so violent, so shocking, that even those closest to her would struggle to believe the truth. What really happened behind closed doors? What drove a woman of wealth, class, and influence to commit the unthinkable? And how did a moment of fury spiral into a crime so brutal it would leave an entire community reeling? Before we dive into this chilling case, like this video and subscribe for more twisted tales of love, deception, and deadly obsession. Janiyah Whitaker was the kind of woman people admired, envied, and even feared. At 43 years old, she had spent decades crafting a life most could only dream of, one of elegance, influence, and undeniable power. As the wife of Judge Rashawn Whitaker, she didn't just stand beside him, she enhanced him, elevating their family into the highest ranks of Ohio's black elite. She was a woman who understood the rules of high society and played them better than anyone. Graceful yet commanding, polished yet ruthless when necessary, Janiyah's presence alone was enough to command respect in any room she entered. Her life was a testament to discipline and devotion. She had built a reputation as a philanthropist, a woman who dedicated her time to charities, social causes, and community initiatives. She was the picture of refinement, the kind of woman who made headlines for her impeccable style at galas and fundraisers. To the outside world, she had it all, a devoted husband, 3 beautiful children, a life of luxury, and the unwavering admiration of those who looked up to her. She was the embodiment of class, the kind of woman who held herself with a quiet authority, never allowing even the smallest hint of scandal to taint her carefully curated world. And then her husband, Rashawn Whitaker. At 47 years old, he was a man whose name carried weight in Ohio's legal system. A brilliant mind, a skilled orator, a judge known for his sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice. He had built his career on discipline, strategy, and an unshakable belief in order. But more than that, Rashawn was charismatic, charming in a way that made people trust him, believe in him. He wasn't just respected, he was admired, the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. Together, Rashawn and Janiyah were unstoppable. They weren't just a couple, they were a force. Their marriage was built on more than just love, it was built on ambition, power, and an unspoken understanding that together, they were untouchable. Janiyah knew her role and played it perfectly. She wasn't just the judge's wife, she was his greatest asset. Every move they made, every decision, was carefully calculated to maintain the image they had so meticulously built. To the world, they were the epitome of black excellence. The Whitakers weren't just a family, they were a legacy in the making. Their 3 children, raised in wealth and discipline, were expected to follow in their footsteps, to uphold the family's reputation. Janiyah made sure of it. She was a firm mother, not unkind, but unwavering in her expectations. She knew the weight their name carried, and she would never allow anything, or anyone, to tarnish it. Their marriage was one of admiration and respect, but beneath the surface, it was also a contract. An unspoken agreement that the Whitakers would never be like the others, never like those who let scandal, betrayal, or weakness destroy what they had built. Janiyah prided herself on the fact that, unlike so many women in her circle, she never had to worry about infidelity, betrayal, or humiliation. Rashawn was a man of discipline. He would never risk their empire for something as foolish as lust. At least, that's what she believed. But the thing about power is that it creates blind spots. And Janiyah, for all her control, never saw the storm brewing just beneath the surface. She never anticipated that a secret so reckless, so humiliating, would threaten everything she had built. She never imagined that the man she trusted more than anyone would be the very one to bring disgrace into her home. And when the truth finally surfaced, when the whispers turned into undeniable reality, Janiyah Whitaker made a decision, one that would forever change the course of her perfect, carefully crafted life. Because Janiyah wasn't just a woman of influence. She was a woman of action. And when faced with the ultimate betrayal, she would prove that there was nothing she wouldn't do to protect the Whitaker name. Rashawn Whitaker was a man who understood power. He knew how to wield it, how to command it, how to protect it. And for years, he had managed to keep his secrets buried beneath the weight of his reputation. His discipline, his careful precision, had allowed him to indulge in the temptations that came with success without ever suffering the consequences. Because Rashawn was not just a man, he was an institution. And institutions didn't crumble over meaningless affairs. He had always been discreet. The women came and went, each one carefully chosen, each one understanding the unspoken rules of their arrangement. There were no emotions, no expectations, no loose ends. He made sure of it. Janiyah, his wife, his partner in power, was none the wiser, or at least, she never let on if she knew. Perhaps she had always suspected, but she was too dignified, too strategic, to ever let suspicion turn into confrontation. She wasn't the type to air dirty laundry. That wasn't the Whitaker way. But Amina Caldwell was different. She wasn't just another nameless indulgence. She wasn't a woman who knew how to play the game, who understood her role and kept her silence. Amina was young. Naive. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into when she allowed herself to fall for Rashawn Whitaker. At 17 years old, Amina was a bright, ambitious high student, an inspiring law student, sharp enough to recognize an opportunity when she saw one, but still too inexperienced to recognize danger in its most seductive form. When she landed an internship at Rashawn's courthouse, she saw it as her stepping stone into the world of law, an honor that put her one step closer to her dreams. She had never imagined that stepping into Rashawn's orbit would be the thing that destroyed her. She thought he truly cared for her. He was everything she admired, intelligent, powerful, well-spoken. He had the kind of presence that made people want to be in his good graces, the kind of voice that made you feel important when he spoke to you. And for a while, he made Amina feel like she was the only woman in the world. He showered her with attention, whispered promises of a future she never should have believed in. But Rashawn was a man who spoke in illusions. And Amina, desperate to believe in something real, fell for every single one of them. When she found out she was pregnant, she thought it would change everything. She thought Rashawn would hold her, tell her it would be okay, that they would figure it out together. She convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, he loved her enough to leave his wife. She was wrong. The moment she told him, everything shifted. The warmth in his voice disappeared. The calls became less frequent. The nights they spent together stopped altogether. At first, he tried to convince her to get rid of it, to take care of it, like it was an inconvenience, a minor problem that could be erased with the right amount of pressure. But Amina refused. She wasn't some dirty little secret. She wasn't disposable. She was carrying his child, and that had to mean something. But Rashawn saw it differently. He stopped responding altogether, cutting her off as if she never existed. The powerful, charming man she had fallen for had turned into a ghost overnight. He wanted nothing to do with her. Nothing to do with their baby. Amina was left alone, scared, and desperate. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. And now, she was nothing but a liability he was trying to erase. But Amina wasn't just going to disappear. She refused to let him abandon her, refused to let him pretend she didn't exist. She wouldn't let him walk away from the life he created. And that's when Janiyah found out. Janiyah endured the whispers about his infidelities like any proper judge's wife should. But when she discovered that a 17-year-old high school student named Amina Caldwell was pregnant with his child, something inside her snapped. The message came in the middle of the night, an anonymous text that shattered the illusion of perfection she had spent years creating. It wasn't just words, it was proof. Ultrasound images. Screenshots of their conversations. Pictures of Rashawn and Amina together, undeniable in their intimacy. And at the bottom, a single line that sent ice through Janiyah's veins. Your husband has a baby on the way. What are you going to do about it? Janiyah sat in the darkness of their master bedroom, staring at the glowing screen, her hands steady, her breath slow and measured. There was no outburst, no hysteria. Just silence. This wasn't just another affair. This wasn't something she could ignore, something she could sweep under the rug and pretend never happened. A baby meant something permanent. A baby meant humiliation. It meant a stain on their legacy that she could never undo. She looked over at Rashawn, sleeping peacefully beside her, completely unaware that his world had just imploded. Janiyah had always been a woman of control. A woman who handled things quietly, efficiently, without mess. She had spent years ensuring that no scandal, no misstep, no betrayal could ever touch their family's name. And now, because of him, because of his selfish, reckless indulgence, everything was at risk. Rashawn had failed her. He had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. And Janiyah Whitaker wasn't the kind of woman who forgave mistakes. She sat in the darkness, her mind turning over every possibility, every way to eliminate this problem before it destroyed them. She didn't cry. She didn't shake Rashawn awake and demand answers. She simply stared at the ceiling, her lips pressed together in a thin, unforgiving line. There was only one solution. Amina Caldwell had to disappear. April 12th was a warm spring evening, the kind that carried a false sense of peace. The kind that masked the darkness creeping just beneath the surface. Amina Caldwell had spent the day in quiet contemplation, her mind consumed with uncertainty about her future. She had no idea how she was going to raise this child alone, no idea how she would navigate the mess Rashawn had left her in. But despite it all, she still held on to a sliver of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he will come around. That the man she had fallen for, the man who once made her feel special, would eventually step up and do the right thing. So when she heard the unexpected knock on her door that evening, her heart leapt. For a moment, she thought it might be him. Maybe he had finally decided to face her, to take responsibility. But when she peeked through the peephole, her stomach clenched. It wasn't Rashawn. It was his wife. Janiyah Whitaker stood on the other side of the door, perfectly poised, impeccably dressed, her face unreadable. Amina hesitated. Every instinct told her not to open that door. But Janiyah didn't look angry. She didn't look like a woman ready to explode. She looked calm. Composed. And when she spoke, her voice was just as smooth, just as controlled. Amina, I just want to talk. A mother-to-daughter conversation. That's what Janiyah called it. Amina's fingers hovered over the lock, her heart pounding in her ears. Maybe this was a good thing. Maybe Janiyah wanted to handle this rationally, to figure out a way forward without hostility. And so, against her better judgment, she unlatched the door and let her in. The moment Janiyah stepped inside, Amina felt the temperature in the room shift. There was something heavy in the air, something suffocating. Janiyah's eyes swept over the small apartment, her lips pressing together in quiet disapproval. It was a far cry from the lavish world she was used to, from the Whitaker estate where every detail was curated to perfection. She turned to Amina, her voice deceptively soft. "You really think you're going to have my husband's child?" Amina swallowed hard. "I don't think, I know. I'm not getting rid of my baby." Janiyah's expression didn't change, but something in her gaze sharpened. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, stepping closer. "You don't understand what's at stake." Amina squared her shoulders. She refused to be intimidated. "I don't care about your reputation, Mrs. Whitaker. This is Rashawn's child. He doesn't get to just walk away from it." Janiyah exhaled a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking her head. And then, in an instant, the mask slipped. "You think you're special? You think you're the first little girl he's used and discarded?" Her voice turned sharp, laced with venom. "He was never going to leave me. Never. You were a distraction, Amina. A moment of weakness. And now you're threatening everything we've built because of some childish fantasy." The word stung, but Amina refused to back down. "This isn't a fantasy. It's real. And whether you like it or not, that baby is coming." Silence. A long, charged silence. And then, without warning, Janiyah's hand shot out, striking Amina across the face with a force that sent her stumbling backward. The young woman barely had time to react before the second blow came harder, more violent. Amina gasped, tasting blood, her vision blurring as she crashed against the coffee table. Janiyah wasn't done. Before Amina could get up, Janiyah reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a pair of brass knuckles, slipping them onto her fingers with practiced ease. And then she descended. The first punch shattered Amina's nose. The second split her lip wide open. The third knocked one of her teeth loose. She tried to scream, but the sound barely made it past her bloodied mouth before another punch silenced her. Janiyah moved with a precision that was terrifying, like she had done this before, like she knew exactly where to strike to cause the most damage. Amina thrashed beneath her, desperate to escape, but Janiyah was relentless, her blows landing with a sickening crunch. And then, just as suddenly as it started, Janiyah paused. She stood over Amina, breathing heavily, her knuckles dripping with blood. Amina's body trembled, her face barely recognizable beneath the swelling and bruises. For a brief moment, it seemed like it was over. But then Amina tried to move. Tried to crawl away. And that was when Janiyah reached for the hammer. Amina barely had time to lift her head before Janiyah brought it down, once, twice, 3 times. The sickening crack of bone filled the apartment, followed by the faint gurgling sounds of Amina's final breaths. By the time it was over, the room was eerily silent. The only sound was Janiyah's steady breathing as she wiped the sweat from her brow, surveying the carnage before her. She straightened, smoothing down the creases in her blouse, adjusting her pearl necklace. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't shaken. She was simply finished. Carefully, methodically, she wiped the blood from her shoes, picked up her handbag, and walked toward the door. Surveillance cameras caught her leaving the apartment building minutes later. Her expression was unreadable, her pace steady, controlled. She didn't look like a woman who had just committed murder. She looked like a woman who had simply taken care of an inconvenience. That night, Janiyah returned home, took a long, hot shower, and prepared dinner for her family. She smiled at her children, kissed Rashawn goodnight, and lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling in quiet satisfaction. Amina Caldwell was gone. And as far as Janiyah was concerned, the problem had been solved.
It was the smell that first alerted the neighbors. The metallic stench of blood, thick and suffocating, seeped from beneath the apartment door, curling into the hallway like a sinister whisper. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the silence. The night before, there had been noise, muffled voices, then shouting, then something worse. A scream. Brief, sharp, and abruptly cut off. A few neighbors had heard it, but no one had wanted to get involved. Not at first. Not until the next day, when Amina's door remained shut, and the eerie stillness in her apartment stretched on for too long. It was Mrs. Martinez, the elderly woman from across the hall, who finally called the police. She had seen Amina just the day before, smiling, carrying a bag of groceries, humming softly to herself. Now, something was wrong. When officers arrived and knocked on the door, there was no response. No sound, no movement. Nothing. What they found inside was something out of a nightmare. Amina Caldwell lay sprawled in the center of her living room, surrounded by a pool of thick, dark blood that had dried around her in a grotesque halo. Her face, if it could still be called that, was barely recognizable. Her nose was crushed, her lips split open, her teeth shattered. But it was her skull that told the true horror of what had happened. It wasn't just broken, it was destroyed, caved in from the force of multiple blows, exposing fragments of bone and brain matter. And then, there was her stomach. Flat. Motionless. Lifeless. The baby inside her had never stood a chance. The scene was violent. Personal. This wasn't a random act of brutality, it was something far more intimate. Detectives knew immediately, this was no ordinary homicide. This was a crime driven by rage. By hatred. By someone who wanted Amina not just dead, but erased. The investigation moved quickly. Amina's phone, found on the floor beside her body, was still unlocked, her last text message frozen on the screen. A simple, nervous message sent to a friend just before she opened the door. Rashawn's wife is here. That was all detectives needed to shift their focus. Janiyah Whitaker. The perfect wife. The polished socialite. The devoted mother. The woman whose entire identity was built on power, prestige, and control. The unraveling began almost immediately. Security footage from the apartment complex showed Janiyah arriving that night, dressed in her usual elegance, her heels clicking against the pavement. The same footage showed her leaving less than an hour later, walking briskly, carefully avoiding the small bloodstains on the hem of her designer coat. It was the coat that sealed her fate. A single microscopic droplet of blood, invisible to the naked eye, had splattered onto the fabric. And when forensic analysts tested it, the results were undeniable. It was Amina's blood. Janiyah had been careful, but not careful enough. Rashawn, now facing a scandal that threatened to destroy his career, wasted no time in separating himself from his wife. He denied any involvement, refused to answer questions, and most damning of all refused to defend her. And so, on April 15, as Janiyah stood center stage at an extravagant charity gala, basking in the admiration of Ohio's elite, the moment she had spent her entire life preparing for came crashing down in a way she had never imagined. The police entered the ballroom with quiet authority, their presence sending a ripple of unease through the glittering crowd. Janiyah, poised as ever, barely flinched when they approached her. "Mrs. Whitaker, you're under arrest for the murder of Amina Caldwell and her unborn child." Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped their champagne glass. The soft notes of the live jazz band faltered into an awkward silence. Janiyah's hands remained steady as the officers cuffed her, her face a mask of cold detachment. No tears. No pleas. No protests of innocence. She simply lifted her chin, as if daring the world to look at her, to judge her, to admire her even in this moment of downfall. The cameras flashed. The whispers turned into full-blown murmurs. And as Janiyah was led out of the grand ballroom, past the stunned faces of Ohio's most powerful, she remained composed. Regal, even. Because in her mind, she wasn't just a woman being arrested. She was a woman being betrayed. By the system. By her husband. By the very image she had spent a lifetime perfecting. And for the first time in her life, Janiyah Whitaker had lost control. The trial of Janiyah Whitaker wasn't just another courtroom drama, it was a spectacle, a national obsession that ignited debates across dinner tables, news stations, and social media feeds. How could a woman so poised, so revered, so untouchable, commit such a monstrous crime? Some called it a crime of passion, the tragic unraveling of a betrayed woman who had lost everything. Others saw it for what it was: cold, calculated murder. From the moment Janiyah stepped into that courtroom, dressed in a tailored navy suit, her hair sleek and perfectly styled, she commanded attention. Even in shackles, she exuded the same quiet power she had wielded for years. But this time, the world wasn't admiring her. It was judging her. Seated in the front row, just feet away from the woman who had bludgeoned their daughter to death, were Amina Caldwell's grieving parents. Mrs. Caldwell, once a strong and vibrant woman, looked hollowed out by grief, her body wrapped in black, her eyes swollen from endless nights of weeping. Mr. Caldwell sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. They didn't look at Janiyah as she took her seat. They couldn't. They had already seen her face too many times on the news, in the papers, in their nightmares. The prosecution wasted no time dismantling the illusion of Janiyah Whitaker. They painted her as an elitist, a woman so obsessed with perfection and power that she viewed a 17-year-old high school girl and her unborn child as stains to be wiped away. They played the security footage, the chilling images of Janiyah arriving at Amina's apartment, and then leaving less than an hour later, calm, composed, untouched by the brutality she had just inflicted. They read aloud Amina's last text message, the message she never got the chance to send. "Rashawn's wife is here." A courtroom full of people, journalists, onlookers, even the jury, flinched at the weight of those 4 words. Then came the voice recordings. Rashawn, though not on trial, had been forced to hand over months' worth of messages between him and his wife. In those messages, Janiyah's carefully curated image began to crack. Her tone, once smooth and controlled, became erratic, desperate, venomous. "You humiliated me, Rashawn. Do you even understand what you've done? She thinks she can just have your baby and ruin everything we built. She doesn't get to win. I won't let her." The jury listened in eerie silence. Then another message. "I swear to God, I will not let this girl destroy my family. I will fix this." A sharp, suffocating tension filled the room. This wasn't a woman caught off guard by betrayal. This was a woman who had made a decision. The defense, grasping at straws, tried to argue that Janiyah was a broken woman, a wife driven to the edge by her husband's infidelity. They called psychologists to the stand, painting her as someone who suffered from extreme emotional distress, a woman who snapped in the heat of the moment. But no one believed that. Amina's mother sobbed quietly into her hands as photos of her daughter's mutilated body were shown to the jury. Janiyah. She didn't cry. Not once. Not when Amina's father took the stand, his voice trembling with rage as he described his baby girl, the way she used to call him every morning, the way she was going to make something of herself, the way she was going to be a mother. Not when the medical examiner described, in excruciating detail, how Amina had fought for her life, how the first blow hadn't killed her, how she had suffered. Not even when Rashawn took the stand. The man who had once stood beside her, who had built an empire with her, now barely looked at her. He was no longer Judge Rashawn Whitaker, Ohio's most admired legal mind. He was just another disgraced man brought down by his own arrogance. He admitted to the affair. Admitted to knowing about the pregnancy. Admitted to pushing Amina away once she told him. But he denied everything else. "I had no idea my wife was capable of this," he said, his voice even, detached. He didn't defend her. He didn't fight for her. And Janiyah? She didn't fight for herself. Because she knew. She had already lost. After 4 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. The verdict? Guilty. First-degree murder. Fetal homicide. Janiyah Whitaker, once the picture of grace and dignity, now just another convicted killer. The judge, one of Rashawn's former colleagues, didn't hesitate. Life in prison. No parole. There was no outburst. No screams. Just silence. Janiyah sat motionless, her perfect mask cracking just slightly as the weight of her fate settled onto her shoulders. Amina's parents wept. Rashawn bowed his head. And the world watched as Janiyah Whitaker, the woman who had spent her life crafting an image of perfection, was led away in handcuffs, her legacy reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale. Janiyah Whitaker had everything: wealth, influence, a family that looked perfect from the outside. But one betrayal shattered the illusion, exposing the darkness beneath. Instead of walking away, she let rage consume her, turning her into something unrecognizable. Was it love? Pride? A desperate need to control the narrative of her life? In the end, none of it mattered. Amina Caldwell and her unborn child were gone. Janiyah was behind bars. Rashawn lost everything. And a family was left to grieve a future stolen by violence. Could it have ended differently? Maybe. But once the truth surfaced, there was no turning back. If this story left you speechless, make sure to like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.